Hello everyone, good day. I am Daniel Gil Chua from Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in English, second year. And I will be your reporter for today's video. Next slide, please. Measuring L2 Listening by Aaron Olaf Batty. Next slide, please. The objectives. First, distinguish the terms needed to be understood in learning upon measuring second language listening. Second, differentiate the process and tasks that determine second language learning and comprehension. Third, perform the designated learning in second language improvement. Next slide, please. The background of measuring L2 listening. Listening occupies a peculiar place among the language skills in that, while it is the first skill humans develop in their first language and is how they acquire it, it received very little research or attention in the second language until well into the second half of the 20th century. This was said by Taylor and Jaron Paya in 2011. It has occupied a relatively low priority in second language acquisition or the SLA research and is often argued to be the hardest language skill to test, set by Field in 2013. Nonetheless, its importance to second language acquisition is undeniable, and listening tasks have featured on large-scale language tests since the early 1900s at the latest, said by Taylor and Jaron Paya in 2011.
A brief history of L2 listening research and assessment. The history of second language listening assessment is remarkable, with listening appearing in 1913 on Cambridge University's Certificate of Proficiency in English, which included a 30-minute dictation task. As the audiolingual approach, language pedagogy gained traction objective. Discrete point listening tests came to dominate L2 listening assessment, at least by the mid-20th century. These tasks, which were frequently implemented as multiple choice items, emphasize skills such as phonemic discrimination, paraphrasing, and selecting appropriate responses to questions posed audibly. Listening tasks expanded their scope beyond such relatively mundane language skills as tape recorders became more widely available in 1960s and 1970s. With the introduction of communicative language teaching, that it began to play a larger role in L2 language instruction. However, it wasn't until early 1990s that listening took off. As a common introduction of communicative language teaching, that it began to play a larger role in L2 language instruction. However, it wasn't until the early 1990s that listening took off as a common topic of SLA research. And since then, research has taken many different directions, including psychometric measurement, discourse analysis, listener study, and listening for specific purposes such as lecture listening.
The listening process. One commonality between the various definitions of listening in the literature is their conception of listening primarily as a process. This is true because we can say that listening is really a process because it takes a lot of consideration. It takes a lot of understanding because you don't have the ability to understand what you're trying to listen to if you don't have the ability to process the thought or the context of that information. So, early conception of the process includes the bottom up and the top down approaches to making sense of auditory information. So, the bottom up is the process of building a mental representation of meaning from the words understood in the input, and top down being the use of other information, for example, background, knowledge, the context, the nonverbal cues, and etc. One influential model is that popularized by Field in 2013, which separates the process involved in making sense of spoken language into two broad categories, the decoding and the meaning building. Decoding. The first step to processing is phonological decoding, in which the auditory stream is parsed into L2 phonemes. This is a task much more fraught than it may first appear. The first challenge is neurological commitment to one's L1 phonemic system, which hinders later ability to perceive L2 phonemes. Additionally, proper speech production includes many variations of phonemes, due to weak or reduced forms, regional or personal variations in others, of which the listener must be aware of being able to assemble them into syllables, words, and lexical chunks. This is again challenged by the fact that in connected speech, word boundaries are often indistinct, and there are often striking differences between words, citations, forms, and how they are pronounced in the real world. So, this decoding is really hard in terms of the second language because all of us are very dedicated in our first language. So, in order to be able to decode the second language, we really need to understand and learn the second language that we want to learn. Next slide, please. Meaning building. Once the auditory stream has been parsed into words and syntax, the listener uses other informations to interpret the input and to build a mental representation of the meaning. This can include nonverbal signals, knowledge about the world, including cultural pragmatic expectations, or what the speakers said, up to the point all of which is information that one uses to build meaning while listening in the L1 as well, said by Field in 2009. However, the listening process is not thought to be unidirectional. From decoding to meaning building, rather listeners, whether they are working in the L1 or the L2, employ all of these simultaneously, continuously monitoring their understanding, said by Imhoff in 2010. Based on the entire range of information available, all the way from the phoneme through to overarching cultural values, deficiencies in any of these can degrade or even destroy the listener's comprehension of the speaker's message. So, in terms of learning or understanding second language, um, we can also have deficiencies in terms of understanding the context of the message, not just by decoding it. Phonological processing. There has been a great deal of psycholinguistic research interest in the process involved in L2 listening in recent years. One challenge facing L2 listeners is that foreign phonemes must be perceived through the acquired phonemic system of the L1 shortly after the first year of life. The difficulty of this is only exacerbated by normal variability between speakers, speech rates, and phonetic context, said by Ross in 2016. Given the difficulty of phonological decoding for L2 listeners, one would expect that higher phonological complexity could be associated with more difficult tests. Raves and Brown-Folks in 2013 investigated this assumption, among others, but found that it was in fact a poor predictor of test difficulty with their sample and interest. And instrument. Sorry. Next slide, please. One challenge of phonological decoding for the L2 listener is the fact that natural connected speech, wherein speakers use reduced or weak forms in order to speak more quickly and efficiently, differs quickly from words spoken in isolation. This problem has also been a popular topic of SLA research, especially with regard to the efficiency of instruction. This interest is shared by recent assessment researchers as well, with assessment scholars advocating for more authentic or even unscripted materials in L2 listening tests, said by Wagner in 2014 to enhance test cognitive validity.
Skills. This can be described in terms of abilities, such as number 1, ability to recognize vocabulary use in core conversational topics, or as a component of language ability such as vocabulary. Number 2, they can also be addressed by examining test characteristics that correspond to a particular listening skill or component. Number 3, demonstrate the importance of L2 vocabulary knowledge by suggesting that, like reading, L2 listening may require a threshold vocabulary level below which the percentage of unknown words becomes too large to be guessed based on the surrounding known words. Strategies. Listening strategies have been major focus of SLA listening research for several decades. Numerous taxonomies of behaviors that listeners employ to facilitate learning or comprehension of their L2s have resulted from research into listening strategies. But the most frequently cited classification of strategies, which break learning strategies into three categories. Number 1, actively and consciously monitoring one's learning metacognitive strategies. Number 2, planning for a learning task, checking one's understanding. Number 3, identifying problems in comprehension cognitive strategies, doing things. Recently, metacognitive strategies have received the most attention, especially in relation to acquisition.
Okay. Nonverbal and visual cues. When the International Listening Association met in 1995 to define listening, the source of the most disagreement was whether to consider nonverbal communication to be a part of listening. Nonverbal behavior ultimately won out, and it is easy to see why. Most of the time, when we are listening to people speak, we can see them as well, picking up cues from their facial expressions and other body language. We can also glean additional information from the setting, such as the classroom or a cafe of an office. All these sources of information operate as a co-text to the verbal signals and help us shape our expectations and improve our interpretations of what is heard. In fact, some research has found that up to 66% of the meaning in a social situation is encoded in the visual channel and is particularly useful for revealing the speaker's attitude, emotions, personality, and interpersonal relations. This was said by Morgan, Guerrero, and Floyd in 2016. So, for example, when we are agreeing into something, we nod our head, and when we don't agree into something, we shake our head like this. So that is an example of nonverbal and visual cues. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Discrete task. Discrete tasks aims to measure a single point with a single item, be it the correct recognition of a phoneme, an appropriate paraphrase of a stimulus, identifying a detail from a conversation, or making an ambiguous interference from what is heard. These task types all suffer from threats to the validity, as all tasks do. Our brain is wired to contain the correct information, not really contain the correct information, but we try to get the correct information the best way possible. If we are encountered with words that sound alike with another word, then we try to find the correct form based on how we read its context. For example, phonemic pairs. Task takers must choose or write the word they hear. For example, truck versus track. Truck and track has different ways of reading the word, right? So it has different meanings. So it really depends on how you understand a specific word and how it is said. Listening for prosody. Task takers hear a sentence featuring intonation or stress that differentiates it from a phonological similar but semantically different sentence. For example, can and can't in fast speech and must indicate which they heard. Identifying reduced forms. Task takers hear a sentence with a phonologically or lexically reduced forms. For example, give him an inch and he will take a mile, and must indicate or write that what word has been reduced. For this was said by Ito in 2006. Next slide, please. Multiple choice comprehension. This is probably the most common item format for listening tests, whether wherein a question about the stimulus is followed by a several possible answer from which the test taker must choose the most appropriate. It can be tailored to explicit factual information or implicit interpretations as long as they are unambiguous. For lower level or younger test takers, the options can be replaced with pictures if the content is of a concrete, imageable nature. Gap fill or short, constructed response. The required response can range in length from one word through a sentence or two. However, the longer the response, the more difficult it is to mark. The spelling count, this grammar count. So those are one of the examples, but I just gave you the how to pronounce a specific word. But discrete task comes along with a lot of errors, and you need to have a correct derivation of that information.
Integrative task. Integrative tasks attempt to model real-world language use by incorporating a variety of language skills. Although this would normally be associated with increased validity, these tasks can be somewhat contrived in some cases. In this task, the test taker must transcribe part of the whole of a sentence or longer passage he or she hears. Depending on length, it can engage everything from phonological through discourse level knowledge. For example, listen and repeat. It is similar dictation. For example, listen and repeat. It is, for example, listen and repeat. Similar to dictation. The test taker must immediately repeat what he or she heard, which can be taxing on working memory and requires a high degree of automaticity in language processing.
Interactive tasks. Although these are arguably a particular type of integrative task, the involvement of one or more interlocutors adds yet another dimension as it allows communicative competence to play a part. In such tasks, while listening, behavior can also be examined, for example, back channeling, um, body language to indicate comprehension and recasts. And also, what Field in 2009 says calls repair strategies. Actions such as requesting clarifications or repetitions, just as with the integrated tasks immediately above. The central challenge associated with these tasks is the impossibility of separating listening proficiency from other factors such as communicative competence. Examples included. Um, these are the examples included. First is the interviews. Task takers sit for an interview with a rater. These can include recorded listening material or simply listening to the interviewer. This is an example by Nakatsuhara in 2012. Second is paired or group oral discussions. Two or more test takers discuss a topic and are rated by a rater who does not participate. This is an example by Van Moore in 2006. Next is information gap. Test takers listen to material and explain it to another test taker or rater to complete a task. This is an example by Batty and Stewart in 2016. Teaching L2 listening in and outside the classroom by Anna C. S. Chang. Next slide, please. This chapter discusses how to teach second or foreign language listening efficiently based on an analysis of the theoretical background and empirical evidence. Firstly, some spoken language features are introduced, followed by an examination of the previous research on second language listening difficulties. Based on the research findings, a listening lesson designed in a three-phase teaching format is presented, namely pre-listening, while listening, and post-listening. A few activities are suggested for each phase of listening. And finally, three outside class listening practice activities are recommended to help ensure the most effective development of second language listening. Introduction. The importance of developing L2 listening skills. The position of listening in second or foreign language programs has undergone a substantial change in recent years, said by Richards in 2005. The most fundamental change is in understanding of the role of listening in L2 acquisition. Listening has been considered a passive skill, and that its main purpose was only to extract meaning from text. However, adding to this role, listening is now also considered a skill that can support the growth of other aspects of language knowledge, such as speaking or reading speed, said by Chang and Millet in 2015. Some empirical studies have also shown that linguistic elements can be acquired through listening. This was said by Vidal in 2011, Van Zeeland, and Smith in 2013. I will use what Chang and Millet in 2015 said. However, adding to this role, listening is now also considered a skill that can support the growth of other aspects of language knowledge, such as speaking or reading speed. This attributes alone is an indicator of how important it is for us to develop our listening or L2 listening skills. This change is important because to acquire a language, a learner normally learns both its written and spoken forms unless the language has only one form. As with some dialects, if a learner knows only one of the language forms, she or he may not learn the language as efficiently as one who knows both forms because reading the written form and listening to the spoken form are equally important input channels and they can work complementarily. More important skills, students spend more time on listening than reading, speaking, or writing.
Hello everyone, I am Rhea Jean Colon and now we are going to discuss about English language teaching. The features of spoken language. It is useful to know some major features of spoken language if we are learning or teaching it. The following are some major features of spoken language. Number 1. Spoken language is made up of many different sounds. For example, the sound is fleeting and transitory. Number 2. Spoken language varies from person to person. When human beings speak, their accent, intonation, stress, pitch, volume, and pace around are varied and they may choose different words to express the same ideas. Number 3. When we listen, we do not hear every sound that is shown in reading because some letters may be silent in some words. For example, we do not hear the sound H in R and or GH in the. Number 4. A foreign language learner may just hear a string of sounds linked together. For example, the phrase first of all may become first of all. The word boundaries become indistinct due to phonological change. Some sound may be changed and others may be added. Spoken language are syntactically simpler than written language and may contain incomplete sentences. Idea units are shorter and generally joined by coordinator such as and, but, or so. Number 6. Spoken language, particularly spontaneous speech, contains various disfluencies such as fillers, hesitations, false starts, and self-corrections, which give the listener more time to think about what has just been said if listeners understand those are fillers. If listeners cannot identify them, it may cause more difficulties. Number 7. Spoken language contains more colloquial expressions, slang, and non-standard grammar.
Factors affecting L2 comprehension. Factors affecting listening difficulties have been widely discussed in first and second language listening. Theoretically, comprehension occurs when listeners can infer what is said based on their linguistic background and contextual knowledge. However, unlike written language, which tends to be more stable, variations in spoken linguistic features may occur from person to person or region to region. Accordingly, listeners face a number of challenges. For example, fast speech rates, unfamiliar accents, transient information, or colloquial usages and slangs, which seldom appear in formal L2 textbooks. This is really true because we often get the best information when we read it because we have time to process what we read. In terms of listening, the information is fast, so it's very fast, and you don't really have the time. Sometimes when the speaker speaks very fast, you don't really have the time to absorb the information that they are saying. So, the tendency of that is that you don't get the full information, but you just get the main idea of what that person is trying to say. External factors, the opportunities. Again, external factors, the opportunities of input and speakers factors. The opportunities of input. Two most important external factors are opportunities of input and speakers factors. Let us look at the opportunities of input first. Understanding a first language requires a considerable cognitive development and constant exposure to different contexts over a period of several years. However, learning to listen in a foreign language is even more difficult because there are more challenges to confront. In a foreign language setting, communication is usually dominated by a learner's first language. Thus, exposure to the target language may be very little, very limited, often confined to the classroom. Next slide, please. The opportunities for input seem to affect listening most because foreign language learners are deprived of ongoing opportunities to develop their listening ability. Due to the lack of exposure to spoken language, some learners try to develop social strategies like making friends with native speakers of the target language to provide them with the right kind of input. Significant development in an L2 does require a great quantity of listening, certainly in the order of hundreds of hours per year, said by Rost in 2005. This is really true because nowadays if Filipinos want to learn a specific language, for example, Korean, they would just watch K dramas or watch music videos of Korean idols because they really idolize the Korean culture. And in the 21st century, we are living in a technological world, so the information of it is very easily grabbed. We can easily grab the opportunity of learning a language because we can listen to it, and we can develop our listening skills by enriching our L2, by enriching our opportunities of input. Next slide, please. The speaker factors. The two most salient and most heard speaker factors complaints involve speech rates and pronunciation or accent. The average English speech rate is between 150 and 180 words per minute. Fast speech rates usually result in a significant reduction in comprehension. The teacher may have to consider their students' language backgrounds and start with a speed most students are comfortable with. For the speaker factors, in terms of learning how to speak a second language, it is really important that teachers take it slow with their students because they're not really that used to the second language, and if they teach it in a way that the student can understand it, then they will get comfortable in learning the second language. Medium factors: text, task, and context. Anderson and Link in 1988 said, "Note that although there are many medium factors influencing the degree of listening difficulty, they all fall into three categories: the text type, task type, and the context in which listening takes place." Text type. If the text contains only necessary information, it will be easier than one containing redundant facts. Text involving fewer individuals and objects and those with which are clearly distinct from one another are also easier to understand. Furthermore, text containing simple spatial relations and with the order of telling matching the order of events are easier to understand as well. This is right because even for me, I like to read more than listening because I can attain the information more. I'm given the time to digest the information by reading because I am given the opportunity to read it again. Or if I'm not given the opportunity to read again, then I can memorize the words by using my senses of seeing. So I get to understand the information well. Next slide, please. Task type. Different tasks may present the listener with varying complexity. For example, Anderson and Link in 1988 said that summarizing a message may be difficult because it is like an evaluating task. Listeners have to weigh what is important and what should be excluded from the summary. This is very true because when you're asked to listen a specific story, then you're tasked to summarize it and put it into words in an essay. Then you would have the difficulty of putting what you want to put or what information is more important. Listening context. Listening context is embedded in the task type and involves three factors. So it involves three factors DAO: ways of minimizing the information processing load, the provision of visual support, and the group work. The processing load is the amount of information that has to be processed and the amount of time available to finish the task. So this is when your teacher is giving you a task and you are given, for example, you are given 1 week to finish the task. Okay. The next comes the group work. Group work in a classroom can increase interaction and cooperation among students, which is believed to be effective in enhancing listening comprehension. So by group work, you get to listen to your teammates' sides and their suggestions, so your listening skills improves. Finally, the provision of visual support can assist the listener to interpret the information or when the environment contains objects to which the listener can refer. Comprehension is facilitated. So at this time, this is when the information is retained and they can interpret the information that they gathered, and this happens in a classroom setting. Internal factors: language proficiency and background knowledge. Now let us turn to some internal factors, which are variables relevant to listeners themselves, such as language competence, being able to automatically decode linguistic elements or having the ability to comprehend concepts, or emotional and physical issues, for example, anxiety, nervousness, being tired or hungry, and above all, listeners' topical background knowledge and strategy use. So earlier we were talking about the external, right? Now we're talking about the internal factors. The former relates to a particular area, such as the topical knowledge of a discipline or background knowledge of a particular culture. So, one factor of one indicator of the internal factors is your knowledge about that particular thing or issue. So what do you know about that? So that it also contributes to your skill of understanding a specific topic. And the general findings indicate that topic familiarity has a significant effect on listening comprehension. So you get to understand what you're listening. You're able to attain more information of what you're listening if you relate to the topic that you are, to the topic that is being said to you. For example, the most frequently mentioned peda- pedagogical model proposed by Vandergrift and Gaw in 2012 aims to help also listeners to become self-regulated listeners.
Number 4. The format of well-designed listening lesson. We have seen some unique features of spoken language and found varying listening difficulties in the empirical studies. As previously mentioned, good listening skills can accelerate language acquisition. Therefore, how to teach L2 listening efficiently has become an important task for language teachers. So, a theory-based listening lesson is presented involving 3 stages, which is pre-listening, while listening, and post-listening. Each phase described below. 4.1. The free listening phase. The free listening phase is particularly important stage for beginner listeners. If a teacher can prepare students well before a listening task begins, then the students are more likely to experience feeling of success. The L2 teacher can do one or more following pre-listening activities. For example, number 1, establish the purpose of listening activities. The teaching of L2 listening is to extract meaning from text. Once meaning has been identified, then the task is over. This is also what L2 listeners usually consider listening to be. However, the teacher should tell students that listening is another way of facilitating language learning. Number 2. Activate necessary background knowledge for comprehending the text that the students are going to listen. Beginner learners usually have limited working memory because they have to decode the language heard and at the same time comprehend the message. Having familiar from topical background knowledge can guide listening to directly focus on the relevant information rather than listening for everything to guess the topic. Number 3. Provide linguistic support. Linguistic support involves pre-teaching keywords, unknown words, phrases, or grammatical structures. Vocabulary knowledge is one of major concern of L2 learners across all levels of proficiency because unfamiliar words may lead to listening comprehension breakdown or misunderstanding. Therefore, it is always very useful to pre-teach some word that the students may not know before listening. 4.2. The while listening phase. Number 1. Do simple, easy tasks that require little writing or reading. These tasks can involve sequencing pictures according to the input text, filling out a form, or labeling, all of which require little reading or writing. By doing such tasks, it can also reduce the loading of students' working memory and enhance concentration. Number 2. Do graded tasks. Each time, teachers can ask students to focus on different aspects of the information. For example, ask students to listen for more details such as the time and the date, and to complete the while listening task, like sequencing pictures. 4.3. The post-listening phase. The post-listening phase can serve some useful purposes to confirm comprehension, clarify uncertain points, and reflect our listening problems. If the purpose of listening is to acquire some linguistic elements, then post-listening activities can direct students' attention to the language of text with so-called acquisition. Post-listening activities can also serve as a remedial work on learners' problem. This can also include reviewing the transcript of recording by reading while listening or reading alone. Another example is evaluating the process of while listening phase. 4.4. Word caution. A number of suggestions have been made about format of listening lessons. This does not mean that all the suggestions in each phase have to be included in every lesson. Language teachers must be cautious not to spend too much time on teaching L2 listening in and outside the classroom, the pre-listening stage, and so sacrifice opportunities for listening or for remedial work in the post-listening stage. Therefore, language teachers should be balanced their time in each phase.
Suggested approach to listening practice after teaching. Some listening difficulties have been revealed by researchers, and many suggestions have been made to improve listening instruction efficiency. However, simply relying on teachers' instructions in classrooms is not sufficient to improve one's listening competence. Therefore, teachers should give their students guidance on doing listening practice outside class. So we have three approaches on making this happen. First is the narrow listening, repeated listening, and reading while listening are suggested. So now I will tackle the first approach, which is narrow listening. Next slide, please. Narrow listening. Narrow listening originated from narrow reading and is helpful for language acquisition, said by Krashen in 1981. It is because learners can focus on one topic. So, for example, whether or sports or one author like Conan Doyle or Agatha Christie, and do a great deal of listening in the area they chose. So, if a student is given the chance to focus on one topic or one author, then they could develop a sense of understanding of that information or understanding of that author. How do they write their stories? Is it fictional? Is it sci-fi? So, like, it really depends on the learners how they can create a pattern of understanding, because like learning is learning is an exploration. This approach is suitable for learners across all proficiencies and is definitely interesting for the L2 learner because they choose the topics. In 1996, Krashen provided some guidelines for doing narrow learning. However, over the years, advancing technologies has made this learning approach much more manageable than previously.
5.2 Repeated listening. Repeated listening also derives from L2 source repeated reading. Repeated reading is one of most common methods for developing reading fluency. It was developed by Samuels as pedagogical application to use with L1 readers who have reading difficulties. The theory underlying repeated reading is to make word decoding more efficient though repeatedly practicing the same text. It is assumed that if much attention is paid to decoding word meanings, then little time is left for comprehending text meaning. Repeated reading is used as a means to assess unskilled readers to practice a very basic skills, like word recognition, and help them move from the non-accurate to the accurate and eventually to the automatic stage. If a listener listens to a text many times, then he or she may require a very little time for word recognition. So, more time can be allotted to comprehending the message. 5.3 Simultaneous reading and listening. Simultaneous reading and listening is also termed reading while listening, if the focus is on listening. Reading and listening at the same time can help beginner learners to develop awareness of form meaning, relationship, and word recognition skills. However, it has to be noted that post-listening phase is listening lesson also involves reading while listening, but their purposes are different. Reading while listening at the post-listening stage is to confirm or clarify what one hears during the listening stage. Reading while listening after class is to enjoy reading and listening to all sorts of materials.
Conclusion. All activities are meant to improve students' listening comprehension, make them feel a success after listening, and prepare students to reach a higher level of comprehension. So every teacher, for especially for me, I am a aspirant of being a teacher. It is each teacher's goal to improve their students' ability of learning. So that comes along with listening comprehension. So the activities that are provided in this topic uh, really just enhances the learning ability of a students. These are just suggestions. This should be executed by the students and which will be facilitated by the teachers. It is also important to let your students know that listening class is simply providing students with guidance as to how to listen. So see, here it is even said that teachers are just someone who provides, someone who guides. They are not the ones who should spoon feed a specific information and, let let the students eat the information. It's not how it works. Um, as much as possible, teachers are given the task, students are given the task to really find a way on understanding a specific information and search of a way on how to understand, because that is how learning happens. Three, outside class listening activities are suggested. Although the three suggested activities were derived from L1 reading, the effects have been examined in several empirical and L2 listening studies and have been found rather effective for L2 listeners also. Overall, listening has to be learned from listening. That is very true. Nothing beats experience. So if you are given the chance to experience the specific knowledge that you should know, then you would understand that, oh, that's how it goes. So listening goes like this because you have the experience of listening. And yeah, once listening skills are acquired, a learner should find that his or her language learning becomes more efficient than previously. Once you know that you are getting better in your listening comprehension, then that's when you know that this topic is effective. Okay. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Daniel Gil Archua. I'm very thankful for everyone who listens to our videos, and goodbye.